So imagine for a second that the walls keeping you trapped in a failing system aren't actually made of concrete.
Right. They're made of vocabulary.
Exactly. Vocabulary. You look around, you see the decay of the institutions you rely on. You see this, corruption baked right into the infrastructure of your daily life. And it's a universally recognized human condition, really. This pervasive feeling of being inextricably trapped.
Yeah, but there's also this heavy sinking acceptance of it.
Totally. People accept this entrapment as fate because they've been convinced by the prevailing powers that there's simply nowhere else to go.
Right. Because the system architects, they are absolute masters at cultivating that exact feeling. They look down at the populace and essentially say, sure, it's flawed, sure, it's deeply unfair, but what are you going to do?
Where else are you going to go? Right.
Exactly. It's the classic TNA doctrine. There is no alternative. And arguably, it is the most effective mechanism of social control ever invented.
Because you don't need physical chains.
No, you really don't. You don't need to build literal walls around people if you can just successfully convince them that the world outside their immediate flawed system is just a void.
Yeah, the system essentially becomes the entire universe in their minds.
Yeah.
You accept your entrapment because the cognitive borders have been drawn so tightly around you that you can't even conceptualize a viable exit.
It's cognitive claustrophobia.
Cognitive claustrophobia, yes. And that feeling is exactly the myth we are dismantling today. To do that, we're looking at a stack of sources that approach this problem from an entirely unexpected angle.
Oh, yeah. Highly unexpected.
We are diving into some deeply fascinating excerpts from a 1979 lecture series, specifically lectures 16 and 17 from the Tului Islam Digital Audio Archives.
Yeah.
It's this forensic analysis of a classical text, Surah Al-Ankabut, which translates to the spider, and we're focusing on ayats, or verses 56 to 59.
And we really need to establish our analytical framework right here at the start. Because if you are tuning in expecting a standard theological commentary, or if you're looking for mystical comfort or religious sentimentality,
You are definitely in the wrong place.
yeah, very wrong place. What makes this specific 1979 analysis so groundbreaking is that it completely discards that passive lens. It approaches the text as a highly sophisticated socioeconomic operating manual.
Which is wild to think about.
Right. It reads it through the eyes of a systems engineer or a master sociologist. We are treating this as a foundational text on civilizational survival.
Which completely flips the script. I mean, instead of reading it as a plea to just be a quiet, pious subject within a corrupt empire, the source reveals it to be a high-energy, active blueprint for agents of systemic change.
Exactly.
It's essentially an actionable exit strategy, right? Designed to systematically remove every psychological and economic excuse a person might have for staying complicit in a decaying structure.
Precisely. And the engine driving this entire analysis is a fundamental redefinition of mobility and system building. The text begins this deconstruction by zeroing in on a foundational directive. It's verse 29.56.
Right, let's get into it.
So the text reads, "O my servants who believe, surely my earth is vast, so serve me." In the original Arabic, the phrase is "Inna ardi wazia." My earth is vast. Now, on the surface, that just sounds like, a passing geographical observation.
Yeah, just stating a fact about the planet.
Right. But read through the lens of systems engineering. It is an explosive refutation of that TNA myth we just talked about.
Okay, let's unpack that, because the Earth is vast doesn't immediately sound like a revolutionary battle cry to me. It just sounds like a statement of fact. How does observing the size of the planet dismantle systemic entrapment?
Well, because the ruling class, right, the corrupt system, it relies entirely on geographic and cognitive claustrophobia to maintain its labor force and its tax base.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, they need you to believe that if you step out of line, or if you step outside their designated borders, you will simply cease to exist. They act as the sole gatekeepers of reality.
They say, this is the only viable land. We are the only providers.
Exactly. The outside world is a wasteland of chaos and barbarians. And this verse cuts right through that conditioning with 3 words, Inna ardi wazia. It says, look at the sheer scale of the planet. The Earth is massive.
Viable ground exists out there.
Yes. Therefore, immobility is a choice. It is not a geographic constraint. It's an illusion created by the spider's web you are currently caught in.
Man, so it's basically the ultimate anti-claustrophobia pill. It completely shatters the artificial borders the system has drawn in your mind.
It shatters them completely.
But the source text takes this a step further, doesn't it? I mean, it's not just saying, hey, you can leave if you want to. It seems to be saying something much stronger about the duty of the individual when faced with an irrevocably corrupt system.
Yes, it elevates mobility to a structural duty. I mean, we often think of moving, of migrating, as something only the wealthy or the elite can do when things get tough.
Right. The comfortable class can afford to relocate. Everyone else just has to suffer through it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the analysis points out that when a local system, whether that is your company, your society, or your nation, when it makes right conduct and systemic justice impossible, the text does not tell the agent of change to just hunker down.
It doesn't say, quietly comply, keep your head down, and just be a good person in private.
No, it tells them to move. Mobility is reframed from a luxury of the privileged to an operational necessity for anyone who wishes to operate justly.
Wait, hold on. I want to push back on that a little bit. Because if you are a systems engineer or an agent of change, shouldn't your job be to stay and fix the system from the inside?
That's the common argument, yeah.
Right, because telling people to just pack up and leave sounds a lot like running away. It sounds like giving up the fight. And historically, when Western translators handled the Arabic word for this concept, hydrat, they almost always translated it as flight, as in fleeing the scene.
That is a brilliant point, and it's exactly the misconception the 1979 lecture spends a significant amount of time tearing down.
Yeah.
That translation of hydrat as flight is a massive linguistic and historical distortion.
Because it implies panic.
Right. Calling it flight implies a disorganized, panicked, fearful retreat. It implies that the corrupt system won, and you are just scurrying away into the darkness to hide. It paints the mobile agent as a victim.
Exactly. And victims don't build new civilizations.
Right. And what the source argues, backing it up with rigorous linguistic analysis, is that hydrat is not running away. It is a calculated strategic withdrawal.
A strategic withdrawal. Okay.
Yeah. You are not escaping into the void. You are relocating to establish a new base of operations. You are moving because you have diagnosed that the current operating environment is so corrupted that you cannot execute proper socioeconomic functions.
Oh man, if the machine's very design is to grind people down, you cannot optimize it from the inside.
Exactly. You are structurally obligated to leave the machine and find a viable operating environment where a new, just system can be established. It is a tactical maneuver.
So it's the difference between a routed army dropping their weapons and fleeing a battlefield and a general executing a disciplined, strategic redeployment to higher ground to gain a tactical advantage.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Okay, that changes the posture entirely. You aren't a victim fleeing, you are an engineer seeking better ground to build on.
Exactly.
And this distinction between just being a good gear in a bad machine versus building a whole new machine brings us to what the source considers its absolute master concept.
Yes, the big one.
This is the fundamental, massive difference between two terms, Deen and mazhab. And looking through the notes, this seems to be the linchpin of the entire 1979 analysis.
It absolutely is. This is where the systems engineering perspective really separates this analysis from standard theological commentary. The text argues that the modern world has conflated these two distinct concepts, much to the delight of oppressive regimes.
Okay, lay it out for us. What is Deen?
So Deen represents a comprehensive socio-economic and political system based on universal law. It dictates how the macroeconomy runs, how justice is administered, how resources are distributed, and how human beings interact on a societal level.
It is the complete operating system of a civilization.
Exactly, the whole OS.
Okay, and mazhab?
Mazhab, on the other hand, is a private set of rituals. It is personal dogma, individual prayer, private fasting, quiet meditation. It is entirely micro-level, isolated action.
So it doesn't scale up.
Right. It does not govern the supply chain. It does not dictate the tax code. It does not challenge the political hierarchy.
And the analogy the lecture uses to explain the difference between these two is incredible. I want to make sure I get this right because it completely clarified the concept for me.
The soldier analogy. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So the speaker says, imagine you take a man and you dress him up in a full, immaculate military uniform. You give him a stick to represent a rifle, and you tell him to march up and down a civilian street for an hour every day.
Okay.
He looks exactly like a soldier. He has the posture, the uniform, the cadence. He does all the physical motions of a soldier, but he is achieving absolutely zero military objective.
None at all.
He is not defending a border. He is not holding territory. He isn't protecting a supply line.
Yes.
That man marching up and down with a stick is what ritual or mazhab is when it exists without a functional socioeconomic system, without Deen. It is the aesthetics of duty without any of the structural impact.
It's pantomime. It's a performance.
Yeah.
And what is so fascinating, and frankly a bit chilling, is how oppressive systems interact with these two concepts historically. Well, if you look at a tyrannical regime, a predatory capitalist monopoly, or an extractive colonial empire, they rarely ban private rituals. In fact, they often actively encourage mazhab.
Wow, really?
Oh yeah, they will build you the places of worship, they will give you designated time off for your private prayers, they will publicly praise your personal piety.
Wait, why? Why would a dictator care if you pray?
Because it acts as the perfect pressure valve, it keeps the population distracted, it allows the subjects to feel somewhat virtuous and spiritually fulfilled, all while the regime continues to extract their labor, hoard the resources, and consolidate power.
That is so manipulative.
Right. The system essentially says, go ahead, be as spiritual as you want in your free time. Fold your hands, meditate, chant. Just do not question the supply chain. Do not question the interest rates. Do not ask why the wealth is pooling entirely at the top.
It's compartmentalization. You get the spiritual realm, we get the material realm. The lecture points out a great historical example of this, actually.
Well, the Hanifs in Mecca.
Yeah. It notes that pre-Islamic powers in Mecca actually allowed the Hanifs, the monotheists of that era, to pray all they wanted. Nobody in the corrupt merchant class cared if you stood in a corner and prayed to one god instead of 300. It didn't affect their bottom line.
Not at all.
But the absolute second a new socioeconomic order was declared, a Deen that actively challenged the economic monopolies, the predatory lending practices, and the political hierarchy, that is when the ruling class went to full-scale war.
Because a new Deen is an existential threat to the corrupt system. A private ritual asks for permission to exist within the status quo. A new socioeconomic system demands the replacement of the status quo.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah, the people in power understand this distinction perfectly, even if the populace has been conditioned to forget it. They tolerate mazhab because it is harmless to their hegemony. If you are just asking for the right to pray, you are inherently acknowledging their authority to grant you that right.
But if you demand a new economic system, you're challenging their authority to rule entirely. Okay, so if I am following the logic of the source text so far, the system is irrevocably corrupt. Hunkering down and just doing private rituals, mazhab, is essentially playing pretend while the machine grinds people up.
Marching with a stick.
Right. Therefore, the only logical action for an agent of change is a strategic withdrawal, hijrat, to find a clean slate where a new generative socioeconomic system, Deen, can be established.
That is the exact operational flow, yes.
But here's the massive glaring problem with that. Let's say you convince me. Let's say I realize the Earth is vast and I need to move. The psychological friction of actually doing it is immense.
Oh, of course, it's terrifying.
Right. Packing up your entire life, leaving your community, your network, your familiar surroundings, and stepping into the literal unknown. People are utterly terrified of that. The fear of leaving the walled city, even if the city is starving you, is a powerful human instinct.
Yeah, it's visceral.
So how does this operating manual alleviate that massive psychological fear?
It tackles it systematically, starting with a crucial piece of technology embedded in the directive itself. The verse we started with ends with the phrase, "Fa'iyaya fa'buduni." Traditionally, this is translated as, "So serve me."
Okay.
But within our systems engineering analytical framework, the lecturer breaks this down to mean align with the universal law.
Meaning what, practically speaking?
Meaning that alignment to universal law is a perfectly portable technology. It is not geographically dependent. The corrupt system tries to convince you that civilization, virtue, and order are inextricably tied to their specific soil, their specific flag, or their specific institutional structure.
They say if you leave our borders, you leave civilization behind.
Right. Out there be dragons.
Yeah, exactly.
But the text says, no, the laws of physics, the laws of sociology, the principles of justice, equity, and constructive action, these are universal constants. If the laws of aerodynamics work in your hometown, they work on the other side of the planet.
Oh, I like that.
You carry the operating system with you, in your mind and your actions. You just need to find the uncorrupted hardware, the viable ground to run it on. You are not leaving the law behind. You are taking it with you.
It's like moving from a corrupted local server to a clean cloud environment.
Exactly.
The code is still perfectly good, you just need to redeploy it somewhere else where the malware hasn't infected the motherboard. That makes logical sense. But let's be real, even knowing the code is portable doesn't solve the visceral biological fear of physical survival.
No, it doesn't.
Because the system's ultimate threat isn't just about losing civilization, it's about losing your life. They say if you leave the web, you will die. We provide your security. Out there, the elements will kill you, the barbarians will kill you, or you will simply starve.
And this is where the text drops what the lecture calls the ultimate risk assessment tool. It is verse 29.57, and it is perhaps the most ruthless and clarifying piece of logic in the entire text.
Well, lay it on me.
It reads, "Every soul will taste death. Then to us you will be returned. Kulu nafsin dikwaton maut."
That is incredibly blunt. It's basically saying, spoiler alert, you're gonna die.
Yeah, it completely neutralizes the system's primary threat by pointing out a biological certainty. The regime maintains power by threatening death. Stay obedient or perish. The text simply points out that you have a 100% mortality rate regardless of what you do.
Wow, that is such a fascinating way to look at it. If death is a systemic constant, then optimizing your entire life purely for safety within a decaying system is a massive mathematical error.
A huge error.
You are optimizing for an outcome, permanent safety, that biologically does not exist.
Exactly. If we connect this to the broader field of risk management or behavioral economics, it is profound. Humans suffer from what economists call hyperbolic discounting.
Oh, right.
We are notoriously bad at evaluating long-term abstract risk versus short-term immediate comfort. We will consistently choose a guaranteed slow decline over a risky chance at freedom simply because the slow decline feels safe in the moment.
Because the devil you know is better than the devil you don't.
Right. By stating every soul will taste death, the text forces a brutal recalibration of your baseline assumptions. It zeroes out the fear of the unknown by reminding you that the ultimate unknown, death, is already a locked-in variable.
It is a sunk cost of being born.
Exactly. Therefore, you are faced with a choice. You can stay in the corrupt web, slowly stripped of your agency, complicit in an unjust system, suffocating under the extraction, and eventually die. Or you can take the risk, relocate, attempt to build a just, thriving system, and eventually die.
So the fear of relocation is completely dwarfed by the certainty of the final return. It's trading a meaningless certainty, dying slowly as a compliant gear in a broken machine, for a meaningful risk. It's a complete perspective shift.
For a total paradigm shift.
But, okay, let's say the text successfully neutralizes my fear of death. I'm no longer paralyzed. That still isn't enough to make me pack my bags.
Why not?
Well, a successful movement, a successful migration cannot be built purely on the negation of fear. You can't just tell people, don't be afraid, you're going to die anyway. That's nihilistic. You have to give them a tangible upside. You need a destination, not just an exit strategy.
You are hitting on the exact transition point the 1979 lecture makes. You need a positive architectural blueprint. You have to justify the immense cost and the extreme friction of relocation.
Exactly.
And this circles back to definitively refuting that TNI myth, the idea that there is no alternative. The rational case for mobility relies entirely on the assertion that a viable alternative can actually be constructed. The text mandates the search for a clean slate.
Yeah.
You don't just move to escape. You move to establish ground zero for a new civilization.
And the reward structure, the architectural blueprint for this new civilization, is outlined in the very next verse, 29.58. It says that those who believe and do constructive work, the Arabic term used is amali sali, we will settle in lofty chambers of the garden, beneath which rivers flow. Now, I want to stop here because this is where a lot of modern readers check out.
Oh, for sure.
They read lofty chambers of the garden, beneath which rivers flow, and their brain immediately defaults to a very mystical, sentimental interpretation. They picture a luxury hotel suite in the afterlife. Sitting on a cloud, playing a harp, endless buffets, rivers of milk and honey. It sounds like a fairy tale.
Which is precisely why the systems engineering approach of this lecture is so vital. It strips away centuries of that passive mythological overlay. The speaker in the source does a deep linguistic dive into the Arabic root of the phrase lofty chambers, which is gufan.
Right, let's break that down. What does gufan actually mean if it's not a magical hotel room in the sky?
So in classical Arabic, the root of gurfan does not just mean a high room in a mystical sense. Linguistically, it signifies abundance. It signifies reaching the heights of human potential. It implies an elevated perspective, continuous flow, and critically, It signifies structural relief from scarcity.
Relief from scarcity, that is an economic term.
Yes. To understand this, you have to look at the physical environment of the people this text was originally addressed to in the 7th century.
Okay, desert environment.
Right. These were desert dwellers operating in a harsh, unforgiving environment of extreme daily scarcity. For them, what is the ultimate tangible symbol of a thriving, secure, and durable society?
I guess water and safety.
Exactly. It is height, meaning structural defense and a broader strategic perspective. And it is continuous, flowing water, meaning reliable agriculture, sanitation, sustainable infrastructure, and life.
So when the text promises Gurfan and rivers flowing beneath, it's not talking about an afterlife vacation. Connected to the physical, socioeconomic world, it is promising the establishment of a real, durable, thriving society of abundance here on Earth.
Yes. It is the architectural blueprint of a functioning generative civilization.
Exactly. It is a stark structural contrast to the verses immediately preceding this section, which the lecture notes describe the fleeting enjoyment of staying stuck in the decaying spider's web of the old regime.
The spider's web, right.
Think about the metaphor of a spider's web. It is intricately designed, it looks complex, and it is highly effective at trapping its prey. The corrupt system you are leaving might offer you some scraps of comfort. You know, a minor promotion, a temporary sense of security, a slightly larger section of the web to call your own.
But fundamentally, a spider's web is fragile. A strong gust of wind, a single sweeping motion, and the entire structure is destroyed. It has no foundations.
Precisely. The system is inherently fragile because it is built on extraction and exploitation. It is a difference between extractive economics and generative economics.
Right.
The corrupt regime is extractive. It constantly drains the environment and its populace, leaving them in a state of managed scarcity. The new system, the Gurfan built on the clean slate, is generative. Oh, I see the connection now.
The rivers flowing beneath metaphor represents a self-sustaining infrastructure. It means establishing a socio-economic engine where resources circulate continuously, providing abundance and security for everyone involved in the constructive work that Amal Isali. It is a tangible economic promise. If you do the hard work of building a just system aligned with universal laws, that system will generate real, durable prosperity.
Okay, the vision is compelling. I see the blueprint. We've neutralized the fear of death, and we have the architectural plans for a generative society. But now we have to talk about execution.
The hard part.
Yeah, because having a blueprint is great, but building a civilization from scratch is brutal. Making a massive systemic shift, relocating your entire operational base, it is going to hurt.
Oh, absolutely.
There will be immense pushback. The old regime isn't just going to wave goodbye. How does the agent actually survive the brutal friction of the journey?
Well, the text does not sugarcoat that friction at all. It does not promise a magical, frictionless teleportation to the new society. It provides a precise operational formula for the mobile agent in verse 29.59.
What does it say?
It says, the reward, the durable society, goes to those who are patient, sabru, and rely on their Lord, Yatawakalin.
And again, we run into a massive translation issue here. Patient and rely. These two words, sabar and tawakkul, have been heavily distorted over centuries of passive, quietist interpretation.
Completely distorted. Let's start with sabar. If you ask the average person what patience means, they will describe passive, sorrowful suffering. Just be patient. Endure the abuse. Don't complain. Turn the other cheek while the system grinds you down. Your reward will come eventually.
Yeah, patience in the modern lexicon basically means waiting quietly.
Right. But the lecture points out that in the context of systems engineering, civilizational struggle, and strategic relocation, that definition is entirely wrong. In classical Arabic, sabar is about structural integrity.
Structural integrity, like in material science.
It's exactly like material science. Think about a building or a bridge. If an engineer says a structural beam has sabar, it means it can withstand wind shear, it can bear heavy compressive loads, and can endure seismic activity without buckling or collapsing. It maintains its form under extreme pressure.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So for a human agent or a socioeconomic movement, sabar means holding your footing.
Yeah.
It means maintaining your trajectory and your operational steadfastness when the inevitable friction of systemic change hits you.
So it's active resilience, not passive suffering.
Yes. When you initiate a strategic withdrawal, the old regime will push back. They will freeze your assets. They will launch propaganda campaigns against you. The physical journey will get economically grueling. Sabar is your ability to not break rank, It is the fortitude to not retreat to the false, fleeting comfort of the spider's web when things get difficult. It is the grit required to execute a long-term strategy without compromising your operational principles.
That reframing is vital.
Mm.
You aren't just enduring pain, you are maintaining structural integrity while under load. And then there's the second half of the formula, tawakkul, usually translated as reliance or trust in God. The traditional view of this is also very hands-off, isn't it? Just trust God, don't do anything yourself, and a miracle will happen to save you.
It's the ultimate abrogation of personal responsibility. It's superstition. The source lecture introduces a spectacular analogy to correct this, and it completely rewires how you understand the concept of trust in a systemic framework. It's the paratrooper analogy.
Oh, I love this part of the notes. So walk me through the physics of this analogy because it is brilliant.
So imagine a highly trained paratrooper jumping out of a military aircraft at 10,000 feet. As they step out into the void, that paratrooper possesses absolute trust. They have absolute tawakkul. But what exactly are they trusting in? Are they blindly hoping that a giant, invisible hand is going to reach down from the clouds and catch them? Are they hoping that the laws of physics will suddenly be suspended just for them, allowing them to magically float to the ground?
No, if they believed that, they would just jump without a parachute, which would be suicide, not trust.
Precisely. Their trust is not based on magic or arbitrary miracles. Their trust is based on a deep understanding of and rigorous alignment with the universal laws of aerodynamics. They trust the law of gravity. They trust the physics of air resistance and atmospheric pressure. And critically, they trust the careful, rigorous, disciplined preparation they undertook when packing their parachute.
They have done the hard, constructive work, the Amalia Sali, of aligning their equipment with physical reality. And because they have done that work, they can confidently step out of the plane, knowing the system will hold them.
That is true tawakkul. It is absolute confidence in cause and effect. It is knowing that if you align your actions with universal natural laws, the system will respond reliably. It is the ultimate rejection of superstition.
So the superstition would be?
Well, a superstitious person hopes for an arbitrary intervention to save them from the consequences of their own inaction. They hope the rules of reality will be bent in their favor. An agent with tawakkul understands that the universe operates on strict, unbending laws, what the source refers to as the law of requital, or mukafata amal. Action produces a corresponding reaction. Cause leads to effect.
So mapping the parachute back onto the socioeconomic text.
If you do the rigorous work to build a just society, if you establish generative economic practices, if you maintain structural integrity, Sabar, the laws of sociology, economics, and human behavior will support that construction. Your reliance is on the consistency of the universe's operating system, not on random chance. You do the work, you pack the parachute, and you trust the outcome dictated by the law.
Okay, I have structural integrity and I have absolute trust in the laws of cause and effect. I have packed my socioeconomic parachute. There is still one final, lingering, deeply visceral fear that every person faces when considering leaving a stable, albeit corrupt, system. Exactly, it's the fear of the supply chain. If I leave the system, how will I literally eat? How will I feed my family?
The biggest fear of all.
The system has spent generations convincing you that it holds an absolute monopoly on resources. If you aren't on their payroll, if you don't use their currency, if you step outside their designated economic zones, you starve. How does the text handle the panic of leaving the grocery store behind?
It tackles this head-on with a provision assurance in verse 29.6 here. And the phrasing here is fascinating because it uses a biological observation to make a deep economic point. It says, how many a creature carries not its own provision, God provides for it and for you.
Now, the immediate reaction of a highly civilized, highly domesticated person reading that is panic. We are so utterly dependent on our supply chains, our biweekly salaries, our retirement accounts, that we equate the current specific economic system with life itself.
We genuinely believe if I don't have this specific job in this specific corrupt corporation, I will literally cease to exist. And the source text does a fantastic socioeconomic analysis to dismantle that domestication. It points out the biological reality of the broader Earth. Look at the birds, the migratory animals, the vast ecosystems. They do not have bank accounts. They do not build storage silos. They don't carry their provision on their backs in little briefcases. Yet the ecosystem, the broader Earth, supports them.
Now, I want to be careful here because the skeptic in me says, wait, The lesson can't be to just act like a wild animal and wander aimlessly into the woods hoping berries fall into my mouth.
No, absolutely not. That would violate the principles of amalai sali, constructive work, and tawakkul, cause and effect, that we just established. They
Yeah.
don't just wander aimlessly. The lesson is about the source of economics.
The source.
Right. Provision, meaning economics, food, survival, resources, is the natural result of right action and alignment with natural laws. It is not the exclusive monopoly of the corrupt system you are leaving.
That is a massive cognitive breakthrough. The predatory regime desperately wants you to believe it is the sole source of sustenance. It acts as an artificial gatekeeper to the Earth's natural resources and says, obey or starve. We own the water rights, we own the grain silos, we own the energy grid.
But this verse bypasses the gatekeeper entirely. It reminds the agent that the earth itself is vast and naturally abundant. If you step outside the artificial cognitive borders of the corrupt economy and you begin applying constructive, generative effort in a new space, you will generate provision.
Wow.
The resources exist independently of the tyrants hoarding them. The monopoly is a fiction maintained entirely by force and fear.
It's about breaking the psychological monopoly on survival. You are not dependent on the spider to feed you. There is a whole vibrant ecosystem outside the web if you are willing to do the work to harvest it. So we've broken down the mechanics. We've seen how the text dismantles the fear of death, provides a generative blueprint, demands structural integrity, relies on the physics of cause and effect, and shatters the illusion of the system's economic monopoly. Let's move into the synthesis and historical application.
Yeah, let's tie it to the real world.
Because an operating manual is only as good as its real-world execution, how does this ancient text map onto modern historical and sociological movements? Does this highly theoretical framework actually work when applied to geopolitics?
This is where the 1979 lecture provides a truly illuminating case study. The speaker, delivering this analysis in Pakistan, looks back at the mid-20th century, specifically at the massive geopolitical movement that led to the end of the British colonial era in India and the creation of Pakistan.
Okay.
He uses this movement, led by figures like the philosopher Muhammad Iqbal and the statesman Muhammad Ali Jinnah, as a prime modern historical example of this exact quest for a clean slate.
Right. And he makes a very sharp, crucial distinction about what that movement was actually trying to achieve. Because the standard simplified historical narrative often frames it purely as a religious conflict. But the lecturer argues that leaders like Iqbal and Jinnah didn't demand an independent state merely to get permission to pray in mosques.
No, they weren't fighting for mazhab.
Not at all. If it was just about mazhab, about private religious rituals, there was absolutely no need for a massive, disruptive geopolitical migration. The British Empire, for all its deeply extractive and exploitative faults, was perfectly happy to let its subjects pray.
Right, the British colonial model was practically built on allowing local rituals as long as the wealth kept flowing back to London.
Exactly. The British essentially said, keep your rituals, build your mosques, build your temples, pray as much as you want, fast when you want, just let us control the macroeconomy.
Yeah, let us dictate the trade laws.
Let us control the taxation, let us extract the natural resources, and let us hold the political sovereignty.
But the founders of that independence movement were operating precisely like the systems engineers we've been talking about. They recognize that private prayer under a colonial extractive economic system was just the soldier marching up and down the street with a stick.
Oh, circling back to that, it looked pious, but it achieved absolutely zero structural justice. It didn't stop the extreme poverty, it didn't stop the famines, it didn't stop the systemic exploitation of their people.
So they recognized that the colonial system was an irrevocably corrupt operating environment. They couldn't fix it from within by just being good subjects. They needed a strategic withdrawal.
The hijra.
Right. They demanded a clean slate, an entirely new territorial jurisdiction, to establish a completely new socioeconomic system, a Deen. They wanted an operating environment where no human entity held absolute, unchecked sovereignty over another. They wanted to implement a system based on universal principles of equity and generative economics, not imperial extraction.
And the lecture highlights a fascinating clash of definitions that occurred during that era. It points out that many of the traditional Orthodox clergy and religious scholars of the time actually actively opposed the movement for independence.
Which is wild to think about.
Right. It sounds incredibly counterintuitive at first glance. Why would religious leaders oppose the creation of a new state?
Because you have to look at their cognitive framework. Their entire understanding of the text was limited to mazhab. They lacked the systems engineering perspective.
Hmm.
They looked at the British colonial system and said, well, the British aren't stopping us from fasting. They aren't closing our places of worship. We have our private religious liberties, so why rock the boat?
Why risk the immense physical friction, the potential starvation, the political upheaval, and the sheer violence of systemic change and relocation?
Exactly. They were content with minor private liberties within the imperial spider's web. They had accepted the Tina myth. They believed the British Empire was the only viable provider of stability.
While the systems engineers, the founders of the movement, looked at the exact same situation and said, our private rituals are structurally meaningless if the overarching economic and political structure is designed to exploit and crush our people. We need structural independence.
It perfectly illustrates the profound tension between passive religion and active systemic change. The traditional scholars were terrified of leaving the provision and the managed stability of the British system. They lacked tawakkul.
Right.
But the founders had the structural integrity, the sabar, and the trust in cause and effect tawakkul, to believe they could step out of the airplane, pack their parachute, and build a generative economy on a clean slate.
That historical example locks everything into place. It takes these abstract concepts of hydrat, deen, and tawakkul and grounds them in the gritty reality of modern geopolitics and statecraft.
It definitely brings it down to earth.
And that brings us to the permanent principle at the heart of this entire 1979 analysis. If we strip away the specific dates, the specific empires, and the specific geography, the underlying socio-economic law remains constant.
Always.
The borders change, the maps are redrawn, the empires rise and fall, whether we are talking about 7th century Mecca, the 20th century British Empire, or the complex monopolistic corporate structures of the 21st century. The core directive is timeless.
And that directive is, never let a corrupt system convince you that you are trapped. That is the ultimate enduring takeaway. The system will use every psychological and economic tool at its disposal to keep you compliant in the web. It will use the fear of death. It will use the fear of starvation and poverty. It will heavily promote the illusion that there are no viable alternatives.
And it will actively encourage the distraction of private rituals and compartmentalized virtue.
But the brilliance of Surah Al-Ankabut, when read through this analytical systems engineering lens, is that it systematically, logically disarms every single one of those control mechanisms. It hands the agent of change an actionable, rational exit strategy. It says, look around, the earth is vaster than their artificial borders. The universal laws of success and justice are entirely portable, they go where you go. You are going to die anyway, so stop letting the fear of death paralyze you into compliance.
Right.
The upside of a generative, thriving society is a physical reality, not a myth. Maintain your structural integrity, trust the rigorous physics of cause and effect, and know with absolute certainty that the Earth's abundant resources are not the exclusive monopoly of your oppressors.
It comprehensively removes every psychological and economic excuse a person might invent for staying complicit in a decaying structure. It takes a classical text that has been neutered by centuries of quietist religious sentimentality and reveals it to be a masterclass in civilizational mobility and systemic change.
It really is a masterclass.
Yeah. It is a stark reminder that true alignment with universal principles isn't about how perfectly you fold your hands in private meditation. It is about whether you have the operational courage to step outside the web and build a just, functioning operating system in the real world. It demands that you stop accepting the decay around you as an unchangeable fate.
Man, we have unpacked the linguistic mechanics, we've looked at the real-world historical applications, and we've analyzed the deep socioeconomic physics of systemic change. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over.
Yeah.
Think back to that powerful opening metaphor about the invisible walls. Look closely at the spider's web you currently operate within. Maybe it's the trajectory of your career path inside a toxic industry. Maybe it's the societal expectations you've quietly internalized. Maybe it's the fundamental assumptions you hold about what is politically or economically possible in your own community. Ask yourself, are the borders keeping you immobile actually physical and geographic, or have they become entirely cognitive? Have you accepted the TNA myth? Have you convinced yourself that there is no alternative simply because the current system provides a fleeting sense of security?
It's a tough question to face.
The text we explored today is a relentless reminder that the Earth is vast and the possibilities for structural generative change are immense. The clean slate exists, the parachute works, but none of that matters unless you actually decide to step out of the web. Let that sink in. We will catch you on the next deep dive.